I'll ask it like this, though. And maybe some people get irritated that I answer their questions like this when they want predictions. Because I look at it like this. Um, all that matters is, of course, what happens in Miami in Hard Rock Stadium for 3.5 hours that night. They could be completely different teams if they played tonight. I'm exaggerating, not completely different teams, but the outcome could be slightly different. Shoot, Georgia and Alabama could have played the next day and it wouldn't have been 41-24. We don't know what it would have been. It would have been something different. But all that matters is, of course, who shows up and makes the plays on that particular night. And we know throughout the college football season that throw out a percentage. I'm going to say 20 or 25% of the time, probably the better team doesn't win. Now, again, all that matters is that they won that game. But we know that the Vegas favorite doesn't win all the games. So if Georgia and Michigan, if it was physically possible for them, because this is what I would love to see. This is fantasy land. This is, would have to be computed by God. If Georgia and Michigan could play 100 times, because that would give us a true ironclad definition. This is the better team. These are the results. How many times would Georgia beat Michigan if they played 100 times?
Well, here this is going to send a lot of trolls over to my channel, but it is what it is. Unfortunately, sometimes whenever your favorite team is the team you're talking about, people automatically assume that you're a homer and that you're just saying that because you're a homer. I did about a 25-minute video or breakdown as to why I have this belief. I would say 80 to 85% of the time Georgia should win this game, just looking at the talent that's there. When you're doing computer simulations and they're stacking talent against talent, you always see one side has a bigger wave than the other one. And when those two waves hit one another, that bigger wave is usually going to push over. And I think that's what you're going to see here. I'm not saying Michigan's not a quality football team, and I don't mean to come off as smug. But my opinion is that if you told me blindly, if you take logos off jerseys, you take names off jerseys, you take all that stuff off, and you say, okay, one team shut out 3 teams this season. That same team, that same team throughout their entire schedule also held 1, 2, 3 teams to just 1 touchdown, 2 teams to just field goals. So throughout the course of the season, only 1 team in a normal regular season scored more than 13 points. I would say that sounds like a pretty solid team. What kind of talent do they have? They have an average quarterback, and they have 15 5-stars. They have 40-something 4-stars. Okay, what about the other team? Well, the other team, they've had some pretty good moments in their defenses, but every team except 3 scored more than a touchdown. They lost to a team they probably shouldn't have lost to in a regular season. They also barely escaped 2 or 3 teams during a normal season. And they only have 3 or 4 5-stars, and they have 44 stars. And I would say, okay, you tell me what you think. Because I'm going to pick the team that's had a more dominant defensive record. Never mind the conferences, never mind any of that. Quarterbacks, I would say, are equal. I'd say that's a wash. I would say the running backs probably lean a little bit more towards Michigan, but not enough to make a dramatic factor difference because the defense of the other team is so good. The teams that are going to beat Georgia, if they're going to beat them, are going to have to be passing teams. That's why I say that this particular matchup, if you just look at numbers and stats and stars, it should be Georgia, and it shouldn't be close.
Yeah, anytime I found myself defending Georgia, and again, I'm not a Georgia fan, so I had no reason to defend them in any such way. I just talk football and just speak it the way it presents itself to me, is that Yeah, you can knock Georgia's schedule to a certain extent, but I think I did a decent job of letting everyone know that Georgia's schedule is quality. Nobody's out there playing Ohio State and Oklahoma and Clemson and Ole Miss every week. those schedules don't exist. So find the team that's got some stacked schedule. It doesn't exist. Because everybody plays in a conference, so they play from the top to the bottom in the conference, some kind of 8 out of the other 13 teams, and then they usually play a really good team outside the conference, and they play 3 cupcakes outside the conference, and that's what Georgia did. You look at Auburn, you look at Clemson, despite their offensive struggles, you look at Arkansas with the 0 on the scoreboard, and you look at those teams. Tennessee, when Tennessee took on Georgia, Tennessee was on a roll. They were rushing for a zillion yards. They were scoring tons of points against everybody, against not great teams, but against decent teams, South Carolina, Missouri, bowl teams. And Kentucky, they put up 45 points on Kentucky, a really good team, a team that's a top 20 team in the country. And they match up against, I'll take Tennessee, for example, because we're talking about them. Then they match up against Georgia. They take the opening drive. They score a touchdown. And then after that, nothing. They can't do anything until it's garbage time. South Carolina turned out to be a really good team. I shouldn't say a really good team. They turned out to be a capable team. They turned out to be a lot better than I thought they were. They, of course, couldn't do anything. Auburn's a team that took Alabama to 4 overtimes, that beat Ole Miss by 11 points. Auburn's a pretty good team. Are they a great team? No, they're flawed, but they're loaded with talent. And again, they played Georgia pretty well into the third quarter, but the talent disparity just kind of wore on them, and they got suffocated, and they couldn't do anything offensively. And what was the final score? 34-10?
Yep. It was not pretty. So when Georgia came into to Auburn, we went to Auburn, and Auburn's a tough place to play. Even Alabama fans will tell you Auburn's a tough place to play. 34-10, and Stetson Bennett threw for 234 yards or 231 yards. We had a 135-yard receiver in Ladd McConkey in that game, and that's a receiver that gets overlooked a lot and probably shouldn't. But Ladd McConkey has a ton of ability, coupled with Brock Bowers being able to be, I think, if not the number 1 tight end in the country, at least second. And then you're going to have George Pickens is going to be back, and we could have a whole conversation on the difference that George Pickens can make in a game. I would say the amount of difference that George Pickens can make in a game is as much as Mechie can make in a game, or the impact that he has when he comes out. When he came out of the game in the second half for Alabama due to injury, their offense started to stagnate quite a bit. But it was too late for that. Georgia couldn't catch up. George Pickens has an ability like no other receiver I've seen. I can name probably 5 receivers on my hand that I have seen do the things he does. And I believe all of them are in the NFL or have recently left. So George Pickens is insane.
So I would think that the typical Michigan fan, and I'll put myself in their place, would see, okay, we just talked about Georgia's regular season schedule and all the decent teams they played and what they did against them, which was dominance. Clemson was the only team that really stood toe-to-toe with them. And statistically, Georgia had the strong upper hand in that game, even though it was 10-3 and they had a pick 6. Georgia was moving the ball between the 20s. Clemson really didn't do anything in that game. But they, to their credit, it was a 3-3 game if you're just looking at the two offenses against each other. And then, of course, who was it that had the pick 6 for Georgia? Anyway, they won on a pick 6, 10-3. So we talked about regular season dominance for decent teams. What happened against Alabama? Because I got to think your typical Michigan fan is saying, maybe we're not as good as Alabama, but Alabama just beat Georgia by 17, why can't we take the same game tape? We've got a tremendous running back in Hassan Haskins. We've got a tremendous change up off of him and Blake Corum to do some stuff in space. We've got really good receivers. We've got an offensive line. These guys are going to play in the NFL, a number of them. I don't have them all scouted, but I'm going to guess 3 out of 5 will play in the NFL and so forth. And now to compare Bryce Young and Cade McNamara, we won't even start there. We won't even go into that territory because there's no comparison. Bryce Young,
there's no comparison, no.
But you got to understand, and I think you do, even if you disagree with it, how somebody would look at that and say, can't Michigan do some of that and maybe win by 3, not by 17?
Well, first of all, the thing that I would point out, and I think that we should point out immediately, is that what separated Alabama from Georgia in this game had nothing to do with the run. It had everything to do with Bryce Young throwing for 421 yards, throwing for 26 for 44. I mean, when you've got a guy in there who's throwing at that incredible number, you're not going to beat that guy easily. And Georgia just couldn't get it done. I don't see that offensive firepower capability from Michigan on anything on their schedule so far. Bryce Young had his best game, in my opinion, and that's what they needed to win this game. So for me, when I look at what happened in the Georgia-Alabama game, I have to ask myself this question: was it that Alabama had the best game of their season and that Georgia had their worst, or is Alabama just that good? The deciding factor in that is that you have to look at Alabama's schedule. So Alabama played 4 of the same teams we played. Out of the 4 teams that we played, that they played, we demolished those teams versus where, in the case of Florida, Alabama won by 2 points. In the case of Tennessee, they beat them soundly 52-24, but Tennessee scored a trash touchdown against Georgia at the very end of the game. Otherwise, they only would have scored 10 points.
And as you know, Tennessee was only down 24-17 early fourth quarter.
Correct.
Yeah.
Tennessee was in that game for quite a while, right up until the end. Arkansas almost won this game. It was 42-35. Alabama beats Arkansas 42-35. Georgia demolishes Arkansas 37-0 or something along those lines. And then Georgia did the same thing to Auburn 34-10 versus where Alabama only beat them by 2. So these are the same teams we're playing in the same season. And the question is it that they played bad games on all these days and they played their regular, normal, everyday game against Georgia, and Georgia's just that bad? And then Georgia played that good against all 4 of those other teams all season? Or is it that Georgia had a bad game and Alabama had a good game? I think that's entirely plausible, especially when you consider that the game 1 week before Alabama plays Georgia, the score against Auburn was 10-10 at the end of regulation. So either Alabama can have bad games and they're not as good as everybody thinks, or Georgia had a bad game and they might be as good as we thought they were. One of those has got to be true.
And for anybody that watched the Iron Bowl, you know that if Auburn would have managed the clock, Alabama would not even have had a chance to win. The game would have been over.
Tank Bigsby runs out of bounds. There was no reason for him to run out of bounds. All he had to do was slide. He could have just slid. I'm not even going to get into that because I can't cheer for Auburn. It's against my religion. But that would have put Alabama in the SEC championship, but likely out of the college football playoff.